My parents work at NASA. The words were barely out of my mouth when the entire class erupted in laughter. It started with a few snickers, then built into a full-on wave of mocking chuckles. The sound echoed in my ears, and my stomach twisted. I had just told the truth, nothing more, nothing less. But somehow, my simple statement had turned into the punchline of the day. I stood there, frozen, as Tina, the class's queen bee, raised her eyebrows in exaggerated disbelief. "NASA?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Do you guys fly to space for dinner every night, Diana?" The class roared with laughter. Every mocking glance, every whispered comment behind my back felt like a sharp, cold knife slicing through the fragile pride I'd been trying so hard to protect. I couldn't understand it. Why were they laughing? Why didn't they believe me? The humiliation grew heavier with every second. I tried to speak again, to defend myself. But before I could, Miss Kepler, our homeroom teacher, cut in with a voice that was colder than I could have imagined. "Diana, this classroom is for reality, not imagination," she said, her tone laced with sarcasm. Her words felt like a slap to the face. It wasn't just the class anymore. It was my teacher. The one person who should have had my back. Her dismissal was the final blow. And in that moment, I wished I could disappear, shrink into nothingness, and float away from the cruel, mocking eyes that surrounded me. I hadn't expected applause or admiration, but I also didn't expect to be humiliated for telling the truth. I looked around, trying to find something familiar, something that would remind me I was still me, but all I saw were sneering faces. Tina's mocking grin burned into my mind, as if she was the authority on what was real and what wasn't. The laughter kept building, each chuckle a reminder that my truth was no longer mine. It had been turned into a joke, something to laugh at, something to make fun of, but I hadn't made it up, I hadn't fabricated anything. My parents really did work at NASA. They weren't astronauts, but they were part of something bigger than anything I could explain to a bunch of sixth graders who didn't care. And in that moment, I felt it. The truth wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to stop the laughter, to stop the ridicule. As the laughter echoed in my ears, I couldn't help but ask myself, should I just stay quiet from now on? Should I stop speaking my truth just to avoid the pain of being mocked? Maybe I should just fade into the background, never mention NASA again, and pretend that I didn't care. I stood there, clutching the edge of my desk, feeling small, feeling like I had just been reduced to a joke. But deep down, I knew I wasn't wrong. My parents worked at NASA. It wasn't a lie. But in that moment, the truth felt fragile, like something that could be easily shattered by the laughter of those around me. This was the moment that marked the beginning of my journey, a journey of finding the courage to stand by my truth, even when the world around me seemed determined to tear it apart. Diana had always felt like an outsider in Sunny Valley, a small, close-knit town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The town was quiet, the kind of place where everyone fit into neat little boxes, and any deviation from the norm was met with whispers and sideways glances. In a world where conformity was the safest path, Diana's curiosity about the stars, the planets, and the vast mysteries of the universe felt like a strange, alien thing. She wasn't the kind of girl who liked the same things as her classmates. While others spent their free time scrolling through the latest social media trends or gossiping about the newest celebrity, Diana preferred the silence of the library, the company of books that spoke of galaxies far away. Her friends weren't the ones who gossiped or laughed about the latest trend. Instead, they were the astronauts and scientists she read about, people who had dedicated their lives to discovering the unknown. In class, Diana often found herself disconnected. Her classmates would whisper and giggle, while Diana gazed out the window, imagining the distant planets she longed to visit one day. The idea of space and the science behind it fascinated her far more than the latest TikTok video. She loved the quiet of night, when she could see the stars clearly, her mind racing with thoughts of distant worlds and far-off adventures. But that wasn't how things worked in Sunny Valley. In this small town, fitting in was everything. Diana's. Love for space and science didn't make her one of the cool kids. Instead, it made her a target. She often felt like the odd piece in a puzzle, trying to fit into a space that wasn't meant for her. If there was anyone who epitomized the image of perfection in Sunny Valley, it was Tina, with her flawless looks, effortless charm, and the ability to make everyone around her laugh. Tina was the epitome of what the town celebrated. She had a way of making people feel like they were part of something special, even if it was just a fleeting moment. Tina's popularity made her the center of attention, but not in the way Diana had hoped for. She was the one who had the quickest comebacks, the sharpest jokes, and the ability to manipulate any situation to her advantage. To the rest of the class, Tina was the ideal, a model student, always dressed in the latest trends, always smiling, always in control. But for Diana, Tina was a constant reminder of everything she wasn't. Where Diana was awkward, Tina was graceful. Where Diana was quiet and introspective, Tina was loud and extroverted. And where Diana was fascinated by the stars, Tina mocked her for it. Every time Diana spoke up about something she loved, like space or her parents' work at NASA, Tina was quick to belittle her. She would roll her eyes, throw in a sarcastic remark, or make a joke at Diana's expense. Is that what they're teaching you at home, Diana? Rockets and satellites? Maybe you should just stick to the science fiction books, Tina would say, her voice dripping with mockery. It didn't matter that Diana was telling the truth. Tina had the power to turn it into something ridiculous. And every time Tina laughed, the whole class followed suit, reinforcing Diana's feeling that she didn't belong. But Tina wasn't the only one who made Diana feel out of place. Miss Kepler, their homeroom teacher, was supposed to be the one who encouraged curiosity and learning. Yet, in Diana's eyes, Miss Kepler seemed to favor students who conformed to the norms, students who didn't challenge the status quo. Diana was an intelligent student, perhaps more so than some of her classmates. She had a passion for learning, especially when it came to science and the unknown. But every time she answered a question or contributed to a discussion, Miss Kepler would raise an eyebrow as though surprised by Diana's knowledge. If Diana gave the right answer, Miss Kepler would mutter, "Well, that's something," and move on without a second thought. But when the other kids answered, even with basic responses, Miss Kepler would smile, praise them, and encourage them to speak more. It was as if Miss Kepler didn't know what to do with Diana. She didn't fit into the neat little mold of the ideal student that Miss Kepler seemed to favor. Diana's intelligence, her curiosity, and her unique perspective on the world were treated with a strange indifference, as though they were things to be ignored rather than celebrated. In a school where conformity was king, Diana felt like an outsider, not just because of her classmates, but because of the one person who was supposed to nurture her potential, her teacher. The feeling of isolation crept in slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, Diana tried to fight it, tried to fit in by pretending to be interested in the things her classmates cared about. She joined in the conversations about the latest trends, tried to laugh at the same jokes, but it always felt forced. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was different. At recess, while the other kids ran around, laughing and playing, Diana would sit under the shade of a tree, staring up at the sky. She loved those moments of solitude, where she could just let her thoughts drift into the vastness of space. It was in those moments that she felt the most alive, the most herself. But those moments were also the most lonely. Diana began to wonder if maybe she was better off staying quiet, keeping her thoughts to herself, and avoiding the pain of being judged for something she couldn't change. She loved her parents, and she was proud of what they did. Her father, Dr. Tom Carter, worked as an aerospace engineer, and her mother, Jana Carter, was a leading scientist at NASA. They never bragged about their work, and Diana had always admired their humility. They were her role models, the people who taught her to believe in herself, even when no one else did. But after that day in class, Diana started to question whether it was worth it. She wondered if sharing the truth, her truth, was even worth the pain. Maybe it would be easier to just blend in, to stop talking about NASA, to stop sharing the things that made her different. But as much as she tried to quiet those thoughts, something deep inside her wouldn't let go. Diana still believed. In her parents' work, she still believed that there was nothing wrong with being different, with loving the stars and the unknown. She still believed in the truth, even when the world seemed determined to mock it. So Diana held on to that belief, even as the loneliness grew, because deep down she knew that if she could just find the strength to be herself, to speak the truth no matter what, she would find her place in the world, even if that place was far from the world around her. It was a crisp Monday morning, and the air was filled with an undercurrent of excitement. The school had organized a special session for Career Day, an event where students were invited to share what their parents did for a living. Diana had been looking forward to this day for weeks. Unlike the other kids, who would likely talk about jobs in the town or more conventional careers, Diana had something she thought was unique, a chance to proudly talk about her parents' work at NASA. For the first time, Diana felt like she had something real to share, something she could speak about with pride. She didn't want to boast, but she wanted to give her classmates a glimpse into her world. She practiced her speech in front of the mirror the night before, going over the words in her head. She'd kept it simple. My parents work at NASA. It wasn't about bragging. It was about sharing a part of her life, a part that was special to her, as the class took turns sharing their parents' jobs. Diana's nerves began to rise. Each student had their moment to speak, with some confidently talking about their parents' role in the community. Diana could feel her heart thumping in her chest as it was finally her turn. She stood up, her palms slightly damp with sweat, but she was determined to speak clearly. My parents work at NASA, she said, the words simple yet powerful in her mind. She held her breath, waiting for a reaction, but what she didn't expect was what came next. The room erupted into laughter. It started softly, a few giggles here and there, but quickly spread like wildfire. Diana's stomach twisted as the sound of her classmates' mocking laughter echoed around the room. Tina, always the loudest and most outspoken of the group, was the first to jump in. NASA, really? Are you sure they don't just work at a space-themed restaurant, Diana? Tina's voice dripped with sarcasm. She was quick to follow with, do they fly to the moon for dinner, or is that just on special occasions? The laughter grew louder, with some students pointing at Diana, whispering jokes and exchanging smirks. Every word felt like a needle poking at her self-confidence. Diana's face burned with embarrassment, and she suddenly wished she could disappear, fade into the background like she had so many times before. But Tina wasn't done. Why didn't you ride a rocket to school today, Diana? She quipped, and the room burst into even more laughter. Diana could feel her heart sinking, each mockery making her feel smaller and smaller, but it wasn't just Tina. The whole class joined in, dismissing Diana's statement as if it were the punchline of some ridiculous joke. She could see the looks on their faces, amused, disbelieving, and filled with contempt. They didn't see Diana's pride in her parents' work. All they saw was an opportunity to belittle her. It felt like the whole room was conspiring to crush the small light of hope she had tried to ignite with her words. Just when Diana thought it couldn't get worse, it did. Miss Kepler, their teacher, who was supposed to be the authority figure, didn't come to her defense. Instead, she added to the sting of rejection. With a sigh, Miss Kepler shook her head and addressed Diana, her voice colder than usual. Diana, she said, as if speaking to a child who had gotten out of line, this classroom is for reality. Stick to the facts, not imagination. Her words cut deeper than the laughter. Miss Kepler, the one person who should have supported her, was now siding with the mocking students. Diana's eyes welled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She had to keep it together. But the weight of Miss Kepler's dismissal was the final blow, and in that moment, Diana's world felt as though it had crumbled around her. The class laughed even harder at Miss Kepler's comment, and Diana felt completely isolated. She wanted to shout, to explain, to tell them that what she had said was true, that her parents did work at NASA. But in the midst of the ridicule, she was left speechless. Her truth had been dismissed, not just by her classmates, but by the very teacher who was supposed to encourage her. As the laughter died down and the class moved on to the next student, Diana sat down, her head bowed. She tried to focus on the rest of the session, but the words echoed in her mind. Reality. Stick to the facts. She had spoken the truth, and yet all she had received in return was mockery and dismissal. Diana couldn't help but question herself. Should I just stop telling the truth, she wondered. Should I stop sharing the things that make me different? Her internal conflict began to swirl in her mind. She had always been the curious, truth-seeking girl, but now it felt as though being true to herself only made her a target. The truth had led her here, to this moment of isolation and humiliation. Was it worth it? Was it worth continuing to speak up when it seemed like no one cared, no one believed? Diana could feel the pull of conformity, the temptation to simply fit in, to stop standing out. Maybe it would be easier if I just stayed silent, she thought. Maybe if I kept quiet, I wouldn't have to endure this ridicule anymore. But even as she thought these things deep down, Diana knew she couldn't just stop being herself. She couldn't silence her curiosity, her love for space, or her pride in her parents' work. Those things were a part of her, the real her. She didn't want to shrink away. She didn't want to hide her truth, but the world around her made it so hard. The more she tried to share her truth, the more it felt like she was being pushed into a corner. The laughter, the mockery, the dismissals, it all chipped away at her confidence, making her wonder if the truth was worth the cost of feeling like an outsider. This moment served as a painful contrast between Diana's internal world and the external world around her. On the inside, Diana was driven by curiosity and a thirst for knowledge. She wanted to know the truth about the world, about space, about the stars. She wanted to believe that if she simply spoke the truth, people would listen, understand, and appreciate her. But on the outside, the world seemed determined to reject her, to dismiss her truth as something silly, something to be laughed at. The judgment from her classmates, the mockery from Tina, and the cold indifference from Miss Kepler all pointed to one thing. In this world, truth didn't matter. Fitting in did. And so Diana was left to grapple with a choice that no child should have to make. Should she stay silent, blend in, and accept the easy path of conformity? Or should she continue to stand by her truth, even if it meant standing alone? As the session ended, Diana sat in silence, her mind racing with doubt. The ridicule had been hard to bear, but it wasn't the laughter that hurt the most. It was the feeling that, for the first time in her life, her truth wasn't enough to be accepted by those around her. The long-anticipated career day had arrived, but Diana had no intention of participating. She had watched her classmates excitedly sign up, each eager to share their parents' jobs with the class. It was an opportunity to showcase their families, their pride, their achievements. For Diana, however, it was a reminder of the ridicule she had faced just days before. The mockery of her classmates still stung. She didn't want to put herself through that again. She didn't want to hear the laughter, the sarcastic remarks, or the cold dismissal from Miss Kepler. Diana had crossed her name off the sign-up list, a small but significant act of self-preservation. She would stay in the background, avoid drawing attention to herself, and let the day pass quietly. She knew her parents' job was special, but after the way it had been mocked, she wasn't sure she could endure another round of humiliation. She sat quietly at her desk, her eyes fixed on the notebook in front of her, though she wasn't really reading. She could hear the buzz of excitement around her as other students eagerly prepared their presentations. Tina, as always, was at the center of the activity, chatting loudly with her friends, giving them last-minute tips on how to present their parents' work in the best light. Diana couldn't help but feel a pang of bitterness. Why did they get to share their parents' jobs so freely while she had to hide hers? The room felt heavier than ever. She wanted to be excited about sharing her parents' work, but all she felt now was a sense of dread. She had hoped career day would be different, but all it did was remind her how different she truly was. The session began, and one by one, students stood up to talk about their parents' jobs. Diana listened in silence, hearing each mundane story. There was nothing extraordinary about them. Doctors, lawyers, small business owners. It was the same stories Diana had heard over and over again. Yet every time someone spoke, the class responded with enthusiastic claps or laughter, rewarding the speaker with praise. Then it was Tina's turn. Tina, with her perfect hair and perfectly polished smile, walked to the front of the room like a queen taking her throne. She started with a dramatic pause, looking out over the class before speaking. "My mom runs the #1 spa in town," she announced, her voice dripping with self-assuredness. "She works with A-list celebrities, and she's famous for her skincare secrets." The class erupted into applause, their admiration clear. Miss Kepler beamed, giving Tina a proud nod. Diana could see the admiration in the eyes of her classmates as they whispered to each other about Tina's mom. They looked at Tina with the kind of awe that made her feel like she was untouchable, like she had something they could only dream of. Diana slouched in her seat, trying to make herself as invisible as possible. The applause for Tina was deafening, but inside, Diana felt smaller with every cheer. She couldn't help but feel a sharp pang of jealousy. Here was Tina, standing in the spotlight, the class enchanted by her mother's glamorous job, while Diana's truth was met with laughter and ridicule. The minutes seemed to stretch on as each new student presented, each story more ordinary than the last. Diana could feel her heart sinking further into her chest. She wanted to be part of it all, to share something important about her family, but she couldn't. Not after what had happened. She felt like a ghost in the room, invisible to everyone but herself. As the presentations dragged on, Diana's mind began to wander. She thought about her parents, about the sacrifices they made for their work, about the pride she had once felt in telling the world that her parents worked at NASA. She thought about how different her life was compared to the other kids. Her mom, Jana Carter, had spent hours in labs working on rocket propulsion systems, and her dad, Dr. Tom Carter, was part of NASA's autonomous navigation team. They were involved in projects that changed the world, projects like the Artemis mission, which aimed to send humans back to the moon. But in this classroom, none of that mattered. Diana sighed, looking at her hands, silently wishing she could just slip away. She was on the verge of fading into the background, resigned to the fact that she would never fit in, when something unexpected happened. The classroom door swung open with a loud creak, and everyone turned to look. Diana's heart skipped a beat. There, standing in the doorway, was her father, Dr. Tom Carter, wearing his black NASA jacket. Behind him, her mother, Jana Carter, held a large binder emblazoned with the NASA logo. The room fell silent. The usual chatter and murmurs were replaced with the sounds of gasps and whispers. Diana's stomach twisted into knots. She hadn't signed them up for career day. She hadn't even told them about it. What were they doing? Here, her dad walked in first, his calm demeanor only making the moment more surreal. Diana's mum followed close behind, her expression warm but focused. They both walked to the front of the room, their presence commanding the attention of everyone. In the class, Miss Kepler stood up quickly, her face flushed, clearly flustered. "Excuse me," she stammered. "And you are?" Diana sat frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what was happening. She had not asked her parents to come. But here, they were, in front of her classmates, ready to prove that Diana's truth was far more than just a fantasy. Her mom smiled gently, her voice calm and assured. "We're Diana's parents," she said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "I'm Jana Carter, lead propulsion systems engineer at NASA, and this is my husband, Dr. Tom Carter, an autonomous navigation specialist at NASA." The room fell completely silent. Diana could feel her pulse quicken as she looked around at the stunned faces. Tina, who had been the center of attention only moments before, now looked as though she had seen a ghost. Miss Kepler stood motionless, her pen dangling from her fingers, too shocked to say a word. Diana's dad opened his laptop, and a video began to play on the projector screen. It was footage from NASA's control room, showing her parents and a team of engineers working together to monitor the Artemis mission. The video captured live footage of the satellite launch, followed by the team's coordination as they guided the spacecraft to its destination. Diana's father's voice could be heard in the background, speaking the familiar words, "Final calibration complete. Commencing Phase 3, countdown." The class watched in stunned silence as the video played, showing the scale and significance of the work her parents were involved in. It was proof, undeniable proof, that Diana had not been lying. Her parents were a part of something extraordinary, something that mattered. As the video ended, the silence in the room was thick, almost suffocating. Diana's mom turned to face the class. Her voice was firm yet gentle as she spoke, her eyes meeting those of every student in the room. "We didn't come here to boast," she said. "We came here to remind you all that just because you can't see something or understand it doesn't mean it isn't real. And sometimes all a child needs is to be believed, not laughed at." There were no more jokes, no more mocking. The class sat in stunned silence, no one daring to speak. Even Miss Kepler, who had been the first to dismiss Diana, was unable to find the words. Diana sat in her seat, her heart swelling with pride. For the first time in days, she felt that familiar sense of belonging. Her truth was no longer something to be ashamed of. Her parents had just shown her classmates and Miss Kepler that the truth could stand tall, unwavering, and undeniable. As the final moments of Career Day unfolded, Diana realized something important. She didn't need to fight for the truth. The truth had just walked into the room, bold and unshakable, and for the first time, she didn't have to explain herself. Diana's heart raced in her chest as she sat still, watching her parents stand before the class. The silence in the room was thick, almost oppressive, as her mom spoke with quiet authority. "We didn't come here to boast," her mom began, her voice steady and unwavering. "We came here to remind everyone that just because something is beyond your understanding doesn't mean it isn't real." Diana's mother didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. There was power in her calmness, in her certainty. She wasn't here to prove a point. She was here to teach a lesson, one that Diana had tried and failed to get across herself. Diana's dad, who had remained quiet until now, stood beside her mother. He opened his laptop, projecting video footage of NASA's operations on the large screen. The class watched in silence as the video showed a team of engineers, including Diana's parents, coordinating a satellite launch. The footage was real. The scenes were from NASA's control room. Her parents were not just involved in the work, they were at the center of it, making critical decisions, ensuring that the mission ran smoothly. The camera zoomed in on her dad, sitting in front of multiple screens, giving precise instructions as the countdown for the launch began. Diana recognized his voice from the video, calm and authoritative, guiding the mission through its various phases. Final calibration complete. Commencing Phase 3 countdown. Her dad's voice echoed in the room. The moment the video ended, an eerie silence settled over the class. No one moved. No one spoke. Diana's classmates, including Tina, who had been the loudest in mocking her just days before, were now frozen in their seats, wide-eyed and speechless. Their laughter was replaced by stunned disbelief, their expressions now something more akin to awe and confusion. Diana could see the change in their faces. No longer were they laughing at her. No longer were they dismissing her as someone lost in a fantasy. They were now faced with undeniable proof. Diana had been telling the truth all along. Miss Kepler, the teacher who had once dismissed Diana's words as imagination, stood at the front of the class, unable to look Diana in the eye. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and her lips were pressed together in a thin line. Diana's mom's gaze swept over the class, but her teacher couldn't meet it. Miss Kepler had been forced to confront her own prejudice, her own unwillingness to believe that something so extraordinary could be true. Diana watched the entire scene unfold, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her chest. The truth had walked into the room, solid and undeniable. And for the first time, Diana didn't feel the need to explain herself. Sitting there in her seat, Diana could feel a strange sensation rising within her, a quiet strength, a sense of calm that had been absent in the days leading up to this moment. She had been so consumed with doubt and fear, afraid to speak her truth because of how others might react. But now, as she sat silently, she realized something profound. Her parents didn't need to prove anything. They had done the proving through their work, through their contributions to NASA, and now Diana didn't need to fight for her truth anymore. It stood on its own, solid and powerful. The truth didn't need to be defended. It didn't need to be validated by others. It was simply true. She looked around the classroom at her classmates, who were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The snide comments and sarcastic jokes had stopped, replaced with a heavy silence that no one seemed able to break. Even Tina, who had once been the loudest in mocking her, was quiet, staring at the screen in disbelief. Diana's presence in the classroom no longer felt like an afterthought or something to be ridiculed. She wasn't the weird girl or the imaginative child. She was Diana, and her truth had just been confirmed by the very people who had dismissed it. Diana didn't need to say a word. Her parents had already spoken for her, and they had done so with grace and dignity. The power of their unwavering belief in her, in their work, was all Diana needed. She had spent so much time trying to convince her classmates, trying to make them understand. But today she didn't need to convince anyone. The truth was there, clear and irrefutable. Her parents' presence, their quiet authority, had made the truth undeniable. They didn't boast or brag. They simply existed in their truth, and in doing so, they had given Diana the most powerful lesson of all. Sometimes the truth doesn't need applause. It doesn't need approval. It just needs to be spoken with confidence and belief. Diana sat back in her chair, a feeling of calm settling over her. For the first time, she wasn't worried about what others thought of her. She wasn't worried about whether her classmates accepted her or her truth. She didn't need their approval. She was enough, exactly as she was. She had learned something that day that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The truth, when spoken with conviction, is powerful enough to stand on its own, even in the face of doubt and ridicule. The room remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Diana could hear her own breathing, steady and calm, as she watched her classmates process the reality of what had just happened. There were no more questions, no more doubts. The truth had spoken for itself, and there was nothing left to say. For a brief moment, Diana felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had carried the burden of defending her truth for so long, but now that burden had been lifted. She didn't need to explain herself anymore. The truth didn't need her to fight for it. It stood on its own, strong and unshakable, just as her parents had stood beside her. As the class slowly began to recover from the shock of the presentation, Diana felt a small but profound shift within herself. She wasn't the girl who was laughed at anymore. She wasn't the girl who had to prove herself. She was Diana Carter, the daughter of two brilliant, hard-working individuals who had done extraordinary things, and she was proud of it. As Miss Kepler awkwardly cleared her throat and tried to move on to the next part of the session, Diana remained, seated, her gaze fixed on the front of the room. She didn't need to look for validation or approval anymore. For the first time, Diana knew that she didn't have to fight for her place in the world. Her truth had already carved it out for her. The class may have moved on, but Diana's moment of empowerment would stay with her forever. She wasn't just the girl who told the truth. She was the girl who stood by it, quietly, confidently, without apology. And that was more than enough. The silence in the room stretched long after Diana's parents had finished their presentation. Tina, who had once been the ringleader of the mockery, was now silent, her confident smile replaced by a look of unease. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting to the floor, unwilling to meet Diana's gaze. It was as if the room had turned upside down, and Tina, who had once sat at the top of the social hierarchy, now found herself the most uncomfortable person in the room. Diana couldn't help but notice Tina's discomfort. The girl who had ridiculed her only days ago was now squirming under the weight of the truth. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to make Tina feel guilty. It was enough to see the shift in Tina's demeanor, the way she fidgeted with her pen and avoided looking at Diana, almost as if she was trying to make herself as invisible as Diana had felt just moments before. For Diana, this was a moment of quiet victory, not one that required loud declarations or gloating, but one where the truth had done the work for her. Tina was now the one on the receiving end of uncomfortable silence, and Diana could feel the roles reverse in a way she never expected. The truth had spoken loud enough to quiet Tina's mocking, to silence the laughter that had once surrounded her. Diana no longer needed to defend herself. Tina's discomfort was proof that the lies and ridicule she had endured no longer held any weight. As the class slowly began to return to normal, Diana noticed something else. The students who had once been part of the laughter, who had looked at her with disdain or whispered behind her back, now avoided her gaze. It was subtle at first, just a glance away when she made eye contact, but Diana could feel the shift. The students who had once seen her as an object of ridicule now treated her with caution, their eyes avoiding hers, as if she were now something they couldn't mock, something they no longer understood. It was strange, but Diana couldn't help but feel a sense of power in their avoidance. The truth she had spoken had put them on notice. They had laughed at her because they thought she was pretending, that she was living in a fantasy. But now, after witnessing her parents' work firsthand, they were left with nothing but silence. The ridicule was gone. The mocking had ended. Diana no longer had to justify herself to anyone. She wasn't seeking their approval. She didn't want their validation. But the shift in the way they treated her was undeniable. They had been confronted with the reality of her truth, and now they couldn't look at her the same way. There was something powerful in knowing that. Diana had not been the one to change. It was the world around her that had shifted in response to the truth. And in that moment, Diana realized she didn't need to seek validation from her classmates anymore. Miss Kepler, who had once been one of the loudest voices dismissing Diana's truth, was now visibly uncomfortable. As the video ended and the room fell into a quiet, uneasy silence, Miss Kepler had tried to muster a smile, but it came off as strained. Her attempts to speak, to offer some kind of praise, fell flat. "Well," she began, clearing her throat, "that was certainly impressive." The words were hollow, lacking the genuine warmth they would usually carry when she praised students like Tina or others who conformed to her expectations. Miss Kepler's forced smile only highlighted the discomfort she was trying so hard to hide. Diana watched the teacher closely, her keen eyes noticing the subtle signs of guilt. Miss Kepler avoided eye contact, her hands trembling slightly as she flipped through her notes. It was clear to Diana that Miss Kepler, for the first time, was questioning her own actions. The teacher who had dismissed her truth, who had belittled her for speaking about her parents' work, was now struggling to maintain her usual composure. The role of the authority figure had shifted, and Miss Kepler was no longer the one in control. Diana could feel a sense of satisfaction rise within her, not because she wanted to see Miss Kepler suffer, but because the teacher had been forced to confront the mistake she had made. Miss Kepler had doubted Diana, had mocked her in front of the class, and now the reality of what Diana had said was undeniable. The discomfort Miss Kepler felt was her own realization of the mistake she had made, her failure to believe in Diana when she had needed support the most. The class slowly began to return to its usual rhythm, but Diana remained quiet, her thoughts swirling in a way they hadn't before. The weight of the day had settled in her chest, but it wasn't a heavy, suffocating weight. It was a weight of clarity, of empowerment. Diana no longer felt the need to shrink back into the shadows, to hide who she was. The truth she had spoken had stood firm, and with it, She had found the strength to stand tall. Diana walked out of the classroom after the presentation with her head held high, no longer concerned with the judgment of her peers. She didn't look for approval. She didn't seek apologies. The need to conform, to fit in with the crowd, had vanished. She was no longer the girl who had to defend herself, who had to prove that she was worthy of respect. She had already earned that respect by simply being honest, by speaking her truth. As she walked through the hallways of the school, Diana felt lighter than she had in weeks. She could hear the faint echoes of her classmates' conversations, but she didn't care about what they said anymore. She wasn't the girl they had once laughed at. She was no longer bound by their judgments or their expectations. For the first time, Diana felt free. She realized that her journey wasn't just about proving to others that her parents worked at NASA. It was about proving to herself that she didn't need anyone's approval to be proud of who she was. She didn't need to conform to their expectations. Her truth, her uniqueness, was what made her strong, and she didn't have to hide it anymore. In that moment, Diana knew she had grown. She had found the courage to stand by her truth, even when the world doubted it. She had learned that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from fighting for your truth, but from simply standing in it, unwavering and confident. As she stepped outside into the warm afternoon sunlight, Diana looked up at the sky, her heart filled with a quiet, unshakable confidence. She was proud of who she was, of where she came from, and most of all, she was proud of the truth she had spoken. It didn't need to be validated. It didn't need to be applauded. It was enough just to stand in it, and for the first time, Diana knew she would never let anyone make her doubt it again. The weeks that followed the Career Day presentation were quiet but transformative for Diana. The weight of the ridicule that had once burdened her no longer held any sway over her. She had learned something crucial that day, something far more significant than simply proving her parents' careers at NASA. Diana had discovered the immense power of standing firm in her truth, no matter how much the world tried to undermine. Yet she continued her days at school, but there was a new sense of peace in her. During recess, she would often sit alone, gazing up at the sky, lost in her thoughts of distant stars and planets. She no longer felt out of place, even if she didn't fit into the mold that others expected. The mockery that had once stung now felt distant, like something from another time, another version of herself. She had become more comfortable in her skin, more sure of who she was and where she came from. Diana continued to read her astronomy books, her fascination with space growing stronger with each page. Her dreams of traveling to faraway planets no longer felt like a fantasy, but a possible reality, one that she might one day achieve if she remained true to herself. And though the other kids still talked about their favorite celebrities and the latest trends, Diana had found something much more valuable: the unwavering belief in her own worth. Her pride didn't need to be validated by others. She no longer needed the applause or approval of her classmates to feel proud of her family, her intellect, or her identity. Diana realized that the validation she had sought for so long had always been inside her. It was her own belief in herself that mattered most. As she sat under her favorite tree during recess, her gaze always drifting to the vast sky above, Diana knew one thing for certain: she was enough, just as she was. Her uniqueness was her strength, and her truth was an unshakable foundation that she no longer had to defend. In the days following Career Day, Diana noticed a subtle shift in Tina's behavior. Tina, who had once been the undisputed queen of the class, had become quieter, more reserved. She no longer strutted around with the same confidence, and her once loud voice was often subdued. Diana observed this from a distance, feeling no satisfaction in Tina's discomfort, but also no desire to approach her. She had moved past the need for validation from someone like Tina. The girl who had once mocked her for daring to be different was now the one who avoided her gaze. Tina, for the first time, had to reckon with her own actions. The laughter that had been so easy to dish out now seemed hollow in the wake of Diana's truth. She had laughed at Diana's parents, belittled her for believing in something bigger than the small world they lived in. But now, the truth was undeniable. Diana's parents hadn't just been anyone. They were integral to one of the most significant space missions of the decade, working on projects that would shape the future of space exploration. Tina could no longer use her sharp tongue to cut Diana down. She had no more ammunition, no more excuses. The mockery she had once so freely handed out had boomeranged back on her, and now she was left to contend with the discomfort of realizing how wrong she had been. But Diana wasn't interested in seeing Tina suffer. She didn't need an apology or some sort of reconciliation. Diana had already moved past it. She knew her worth now. She didn't need the approval of someone like Tina to feel validated. Tina's words no longer had the power to hurt her, just as the approval of her classmates no longer held the weight it once had. Diana had learned that what mattered most was the truth she carried within her, not how others perceived it. Diana observed Tina from the corner of her eye during class and saw the girl sit 2 rows away from her, her eyes on her desk, not daring to make eye contact. It was clear Tina was still grappling with the implications of that day. But Diana wasn't interested in making things right with Tina. She had already forgiven her in the way that only someone who had found inner strength could, by letting go of the need to be right, to be understood by those who could never truly grasp her truth. The silence in the classroom after the presentation had been deafening, but now it felt peaceful. Diana had come to terms with her place in the world, and while she continued to be different from the others, she no longer saw that as something to be ashamed of. Instead, she embraced it. The uniqueness that had once made her feel isolated was now a badge of honor. Her parents' work at NASA was still a source of immense pride, but it no longer defined her. Diana had learned to define herself, independent of the judgments of others. She knew that no matter what anyone else said, no matter how many jokes were made, her truth remained intact. The space missions, the long nights her parents spent working on rockets and satellites, had all been part of the journey that had brought her here, to this moment of inner peace. Diana no longer felt the need to shrink in the presence of others, or to make excuses for what she loved. She had learned that pride wasn't something that had to be shouted from the rooftops. It was something quiet, something strong. Diana's pride was rooted in the belief that she didn't need to prove herself to anyone. She began to volunteer in class more, not out of a need to gain acceptance, but because she wanted to. Her answers were thoughtful, and though Miss Kepler still didn't always acknowledge her contributions with the same enthusiasm as others, Diana didn't mind. The approval of a teacher or a classmate wasn't the validation she sought anymore. Her identity was no longer something she had to fight for. It was simply hers, steady and unshakable. Diana no longer waited for Tina to apologize, nor did she expect her classmates to come around and admit they were wrong. The truth had been spoken, and its power had already been demonstrated. She didn't need anything else. The power to move forward came from within her, not from the acceptance or validation of those around her. One afternoon, as Diana sat under her favorite tree during recess, looking up at the sky, she realized how much had changed. The world around her hadn't changed. She had. She wasn't the girl who was laughed at anymore. She wasn't the girl who tried to fit into a world that didn't accept her. She was Diana, and she had learned that the truth didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be real. And as long as she remained true to herself, she would never be invisible again. She smiled softly, her gaze lifting to the stars above. Maybe one day she would be among them. But for now, Diana was content with the truth she had found within herself, a truth no one could ever take away. Diana stood in front of the classroom, looking around at her classmates, her eyes sweeping over the faces that had once mocked her. The faces now held a mixture of uncertainty and respect, but she didn't need their approval. She no longer cared about being accepted or validated by anyone else. Her truth had been spoken, and it was enough. the lesson she had learned over the past few weeks was simple yet profound. The truth didn't need applause or validation. It only needed to be spoken with conviction from a place of self-belief. Diana's truth had never been a fantasy. It had always been her reality, and now it stood firmly in the light, undeniable and powerful. She didn't have to shout it to make others believe it. She only had to stand by it, steady and unshaken, just like the rockets her parents worked. On her journey had never been about convincing others to see her truth. It had always been about learning to see it for herself. Diana had learned that the truth didn't need anyone's permission to exist. It didn't need to be proved to anyone. It simply was. And in standing by that truth, Diana had found the strength to be her true self without apologies. Standing tall, Diana took a deep breath, letting the realization wash over her. She no longer needed to be the person her classmates wanted her to be. She didn't have to fit into their mold or seek their validation. She was Diana Carter, and she was proud of who she was. She knew her worth, and no one could take that away from her. In that final moment, Diana's confidence radiated through the room. It wasn't loud or boastful, but quiet and firm, like the steady hum of a rocket preparing for launch. Her journey had just begun, and she was ready to face whatever came next, grounded in the truth she had found within herself. The closing lines of the day echoed in her mind. Sometimes being right doesn't need approval. It only needs to be said, and to stand there firm as a rocket preparing to launch. The metaphor was perfect. Diana was no longer waiting for the world to catch up with her. She had already launched, and her future was limitless. Diana smiled softly as she turned to walk out of the classroom. The sun outside bathed the hallway in a warm, golden light, and as she stepped into it, she felt a sense of freedom she had never experienced before. The future stretched before her, like the vast, uncharted stars she had always dreamed of. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but it didn't matter. She was ready, ready to explore, ready to discover, and ready to embrace every possibility that came her way. Her journey, just like the rockets her parents worked on, was destined to soar high into the sky, without fear, without hesitation. And as Diana walked into the bright afternoon, her heart was light, and her spirit was unshakable. The stars, once distant and unreachable, now felt closer than ever. The future was hers.